This video is part of the purchasing instructional guide for Scenario A people setup. Scenario A supports subcontractors that will be used as vendor invoice persons only. The agenda for today is I want to review the Scenario A requirements. There's a nice flow chart for you to take a look at, and if your purchasing process is similar to this one, then this is the right video for you to know that how we'll actually be setting up our users with that. And then I'm going to show you how to actually set up users to support this particular type of scenario. So if I go through really quickly, this is just a nice little overview that if we created our purchase orders, right? So purchase orders are created, and you may or may not go through some sort of approval process, but if you do, at some point your purchase orders are going to have a status of open or approved. At that point, they become commitments and displays commitments on your project reports that we actually have purchase orders that have commitment details for you. At some point during this line, this is when the vendor is actually doing the work. They're securing those services that you've asked for them to do, and they're going to send this vendor invoice to you. So when the vendor invoice comes into you, you're going to enter that information directly into Uninet. But what's nice is you're now going to be able to associate that vendor invoice with a purchase order number. And that purchase order number and that vendor invoice, you may or may not go through some sort of approval process, but at such point you are going to post that vendor invoice to the general ledger. And when you do that, the commitments, the value of that vendor invoice is going to come off of the purchase order as a commitment, and it's going to reduce that purchase order commitment. What's really nice is that at the end, we're going to be able to create customer invoices that show the subcontractor's time and expense and the billable item information directly on that customer invoice. So subcontractors' names, labor categories, rates, and hours, and expense information is going to be able to show up directly on the customer invoice, and that will not have to be a user within the system. Okay. There's a few key features I want to make sure that we're aware of with the Scenario A. So Scenario A, we have subcontractors, but they're not licensed users. We add them to the person table within Uninet, but they are not licensed users. They do not count against your license count. The term we use is vendor invoice person, vendor invoice user. You'll hear both of those interchangeably. These VI users, they come with your financial license. So if you have the financial license within Uninet, you will have this feature of these VI person users to be able to use in various areas of the system. These VI users, they do not enter time and expense, just a reminder for us there, but they can be used in a couple different areas. We can use them in our people assignments to help create a budget for ourselves, for our project management side. We can use them in our purchase request to identify the requirements. We can use them in purchase orders to actually send that purchase order over to a vendor with the specifications for labor categories, maybe the person's name, whatever information, we can use it there. And then when that vendor sends it back in, we can actually associate the specific details of that vendor invoice person to the vendor, to the purchase order and the vendor invoice for processing for payment. And then the customer invoice at the end would be able to show that information, so we can show their end customer the labor information if you choose, the person's name and labor category and their hours and rates and that kind of stuff. But I do want to make sure we know what Scenario A is not. So Scenario A is not some of the areas that you would require an additional license. So there's some areas that if you had an additional license within Uninet, these are some of the things that you would gain that we do not have with the features of Scenario A. So we cannot do planning and forecasting with the vendor invoice person. So we would have to have a full license and the Unisource license to do our planning. Really, really nice feature, but I want to make sure that we know that. The real-time reporting, so real-time reporting, when they hit the submit button on their timesheet, it shows up in our reports. Since these users do not enter time directly in the system, we would not have that real-time reporting feature. The three-way match for compliance, so some purchasing compliance requirements have a three-way match. We would be able to do that with a timesheet user. We would not be able to do it without, but you can do a two-way match with the vendor invoice and the purchase order. And of course, you know, typical efficiencies that we would always gain with a full package of everything being in one place is that we would actually be able to decrease our overhead and our administrative costs and streamline those processes by having everything in one system. So that is not what the Scenario A features are for, but I do want to make sure to show you what those features are so that if this process does work for you, you'll know how to set those folks up. I'm going to go ahead and move over to the system. So this is the 11.0 functionality within Uninet, and I'm logged in as an administrative user, so a system admin or a P&R admin would have opportunity to go into the People dashboard, and under People dashboard, we're going to go to this search and list page. And I'm actually just going to filter all of my folks by my subcontractor. So I have an organization called Sub, and I put all of my subcontractors in that org. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up all of my folks that are vendor invoice people. There's actually a nice new little feature on the search and list page down here that says include vendor invoice persons only. So that's the one I'm going to use, right? All right, so when we look at that, these are users that I put in the system, and I've set them up correctly. Let me show you what that means. So this is on the roles tab. They only have this vendor invoice person role. Notice there are no other roles associated with this user. So if you have a user in the system and they are only associated with this vendor invoice person role, we can hover over that to see what this means. It's not a real user. It's used for vendor invoices, right? That's the only role that they can have. It will not count against your user license within Uninet. The other tab that you need to pay attention to is the rates tab. This is a required tab, and really, really important, the classification, right, needs to be non-employee PO. For those that have been with us for a while will know that this classification used to be called, the list used to be called, I think it was exempt, non-exempt, and non-employee, right? It's now the front end has changed to salaried, hourly, and non-employee. But this new one called non-employee PO, that's the important part to pay attention to, is that a subcontractor who's going to show up on vendor invoices and other areas within the system needs to be that non-employee PO, okay? Cost element, that's information that you can not too concerned with that. So that's all that you need, right? We don't even have to set up a password because they're not even users, right? So we can go ahead and click on the save button. From there, I went ahead and canceled out of here. And so if I was to add a new person into the database, keep in mind the only two tabs that I need to be concerned with is, of course, the profile tab, but this vendor invoice person. And on the rates tab, I need to make sure that this classification is non-employee PO. All right, those are the two areas to make sure that you're set up. And so from there, we can actually use this person in multiple areas within the system. Under financials, we can use them in the purchasing dashboard under purchase requisitions. We can add them to a purchase rec. We can add them to purchase orders. And then under accounts payable, we can add them into vendor invoices. And what's really nice is that we would be able to see those into the invoices for our customer invoices. They'd be able to show up there. So that completes the training for people set up for scenario A as subcontractors, as vendor invoice people only.